wind outside howled like a wild creature, sweeping in gusts of snow that blanketed everything in sight. I was just getting comfortable in my favorite chair, enjoying the cozy warmth of the fire, when I heard it, a faint scratching at the door. Initially, I brushed it off, thinking it was merely the wind playing tricks on me. But then came a sound that sent chills down my spine, a desperate whimper. I opened the door to discover a shivering German shepherd, his body encrusted with snow, barely hanging on to life. What transpired next would haunt me forever. Winter in the mountains is a formidable force. That night's snowstorm was no ordinary storm. It was one of those relentless, merciless tempests that made you thankful for the safety of indoors. My cabin, nestled in the woods, was my refuge, and I had spent the evening as I usually did on nights like this, tending to the fire and letting its warmth chase away the chill from my bones. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and causing the shutters to creak. I was engrossed in a book, the kind you read slowly to savor, when I heard it again. A soft, repetitive scratching sound. At first I dismissed it. Out here, noises were commonplace. Branches swayed in the wind, animals wandered through the snow, and sometimes the cabin itself seemed to groan under the weight of the storm. But then the sound returned, more urgent. This time, scratch, scratch, whine. I set my book down, my heart racing. Living alone in the wilderness teaches you to trust your instincts, and something about that sound felt wrong. I approached the door cautiously, my bare feet padding against the wooden floor. The scratching ceased as I drew near, replaced by a low, pitiful whimper. My pulse quickened. What could it be? A wounded animal? I grabbed a flashlight from the counter and opened the door just a crack. The icy wind hit me like a slap, sending a flurry of snow into the cabin. Shining the beam onto the porch, my breath caught in my throat. There stood a German shepherd, his fur frosted over, trembling violently. His ribs were visible beneath his matted coat, and his eyes, oh, those eyes, were filled with a mix of fear and desperation. "Oh my God," I whispered, pulling the door open wider. The dog attempted to step forward but stumbled, his legs giving way beneath him. Without thinking, I dropped the flashlight and scooped him into my arms. His body was ice cold, his fur damp and rough against my skin. "Hang in there, buddy," I murmured, carrying him inside and kicking the door shut behind me. I laid him gently on the rug near the fireplace, my hands shaking as I grabbed a blanket to wrap around him. He didn't move, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. For a moment, I feared I was too late. "Come on, stay with me," I urged, my voice breaking. I rushed to the kitchen, filling a bowl with lukewarm water and grabbing an old towel. Kneeling beside him, I began to gently rub his fur, trying to melt the ice and restore warmth to his frozen body. His ears twitched slightly, a small sign of life that filled me with hope. As I worked, questions swirled in my mind. Where had he come from? How long had he been out in the storm? And why had he chosen my cabin of all places? The storm outside raged on, but inside the fire crackled and the room grew warmer. Gradually, the dog's trembling lessened. His eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, meeting mine before closing again. "You're safe now," I whispered, unsure if he could hear me. As I sat there, watching over him, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary encounter. This dog had come to me for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it was only the beginning. The fire crackled softly as I sat beside the German shepherd, observing his chest rise and fall in shallow but steady breaths. The room was quiet, save for the storm raging outside, the wind howling like a restless spirit. I wrapped another blanket around him, trying to push away the nagging fear that he wouldn't survive the night. Every few minutes, I reached out, to check if his body was warming up. Slowly, his fur began to lose its icy stiffness, and the trembling subsided. I continued rubbing his paws gently, trying to restore circulation. His ears twitched faintly, and his tail gave the slightest of movements. These small signs of life felt like monumental victories. "Where did you come from, buddy?" I asked, softly, more to myself than to him. His matted coat and emaciated frame suggested he had been on his own for quite some time, yet he had made it to my doorstep through a storm that could have easily claimed his life. It wasn't luck, it was sheer determination. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. The snow piled against the windows, and the wind continued to batter the cabin. I had nowhere to go, no one to call. Living off the grid had its perks: peace, solitude, but it also meant I was alone in situations like this. I moved to the kitchen and heated up some chicken broth, the simplest thing I could think of that might coax him into eating. When I returned, his eyes had opened slightly, revealing deep, soulful brown irises that locked onto mine as I knelt beside him. "Hey," I said softly, placing the bowl of broth near his nose. "I made this for you. Can you try a little?" He sniffed the bowl weakly, his nose twitching. After a moment, he stretched his neck forward and lapped at the liquid. My chest tightened with relief. "Good boy," I whispered, stroking his head gently. The simple act of eating seemed to give him a little strength. He tried to shift his position, pushing himself up slightly before collapsing back onto the blanket. "Easy," I said, helping him settle back down. "You've been through a lot. Take it slow." As the hours passed, he appeared to grow more stable. His breathing deepened, and his eyes stayed open longer, following me as I moved around the room. I could tell he was still wary, unsure of where he was or whether he was truly safe. I began to wonder about his story. Had he been abandoned? Lost? The scars on his body told a tale of hardship, but there was no collar, no tag, nothing to connect him to a previous life. By the time the storm began to ease, the first hints of dawn crept through the curtains. The dog was asleep again, his head resting on the folded blanket I had given him. He looked peaceful now, his body relaxed in a way that suggested he hadn't felt safe in a long time. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat in the armchair, staring at the sleeping dog. Something about him felt significant, like he had entered my life for a reason I couldn't yet understand. As the morning light grew stronger, I decided I couldn't just let this dog go back into the wild. He needed care, a home, someone to help him heal. Deep down, I knew I needed him just as much as he needed me. But then, as I sipped my coffee, a soft scratching sound broke the silence. My eyes darted to the door. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, but then it came again. Scratch, scratch. I froze, my mind racing. Was someone out there? Or something? The dog stirred slightly, his ears perking up at the sound. Taking a deep breath, I walked to the door and opened it cautiously. "What?" I saw made my stomach drop. The cold wind hit me like a slap as I cracked the door open, my heart pounding, half expecting another animal or, worse, something unexplainable. But when my eyes adjusted to the dim morning light, I saw nothing at first, just the fresh blanket of snow stretching across the yard and the dark outline of the forest in the distance. "Hello!" I called, my voice shaking. The scratching came again, this time from below. I pointed my gaze downward and froze. Another German shepherd stood just outside the door. This one was smaller and younger, its fur just as matted and frosted as the one already inside. "Oh my God," I muttered, crouching down. The young dog took a step forward, its paws trembling from the cold. It didn't bark, growl, or shy away. Instead, it gave me the same look of desperation I had seen the night before, a silent plea for help. "Where did you come from?" I whispered. My first instinct was to bring it inside, but something felt off. Two dogs, both in dire condition, showing up at my doorstep in the middle of a brutal snowstorm. It couldn't be a coincidence. My eyes flicked toward the forest, scanning the tree line for any signs of movement. Had these dogs been abandoned nearby? The younger dog whimpered softly, pulling me out of my thoughts. "All right, come on," I said, opening the door wider. "Let's get you warm." The cold hit the cabin like an unwelcome guest as I ushered the dog inside. The older shepherd, still lying by the fire, perked up slightly, his ears twitching as he sniffed the air. When the younger dog approached him hesitantly, there was a moment of recognition. The older dog lifted his head, and his tail gave a weak wag. "You know each other?" I said aloud, the realization dawning on me. The young dog curled up beside the older one, resting its head on his side as if seeking comfort. The scene tugged at my heartstrings in a way I couldn't describe. These weren't just two stray dogs. They were family. I grabbed another blanket and draped it over the pair, then sat down beside them, my mind racing. Where had they come from? Were they running from something? The scars on the older dog's body suggested a life of hardship, but the younger one bore no visible injuries. It was smaller, thinner, and clearly weaker, but its eyes still had a spark of life. I fed the younger dog the remaining broth, watching, as it lapped it up eagerly. The older shepherd nuzzled the pup gently, a gesture that spoke volumes. They had been through something together, something that had brought them to my doorstep. As the sun rose higher, the snowstorm finally began to ease. I could see the forest more clearly now, the trees standing tall and silent like sentinels. The weight of the situation hit me all at once. These dogs hadn't just stumbled upon my cabin by chance. They had come here for a reason. The question was, what had driven them here? I decided to investigate. After making sure the dogs were warm and settled, I grabbed my coat and boots. The wind had died down, but the air was still, bitterly cold. As I stepped outside, the snow crunched beneath my feet as I walked around the cabin, searching for tracks. It didn't take long to find them. 2 sets of paw prints led from the forest to my porch, partially covered by the fresh snow. But what made my stomach twist was the third set, larger, deeper, and unmistakably human. I stared at the tracks, my mind racing. Someone had been out here with these dogs, and they had left them behind. But why? As I followed the tracks toward the forest, a sense of unease settled over me. Whatever had brought these dogs to my door wasn't over yet. The sight of the human footprints sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. The snowstorm had passed, leaving the forest blanketed in an eerie, pristine silence. The paw prints and footprints were partially covered by fresh snow, but they were clear enough to follow. I tightened my coat and adjusted my scarf, my breath fogging in the freezing air as I took my first step toward the woods. I glanced back, at the cabin. The 2 German shepherds were lying by the fire, the younger one curled protectively against the older. A part of me wanted to stay with them, to let the mystery go and focus on helping them heal. But the tracks leading into the forest nagged at me. Someone had been out there with these dogs, and I needed to know why they had been abandoned, or worse, if they were in danger. The forest was dense, the snow crunching loudly under my boots as I pushed deeper into the trees. Every sound felt magnified in the stillness, the creak of branches overhead, the occasional rustle of snow falling from a high bough. My nerves were on edge, but I kept going, following the trail. The human footprints were erratic, weaving in and out of the dog's tracks as if whoever it was had been wandering aimlessly. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The prints didn't lead to a clear destination. They zigzagged, looped back, and sometimes stopped altogether before continuing. After about 20 minutes, I reached a small clearing. The tracks stopped abruptly, the snow disturbed as if there had been a struggle. My heart raced as I scanned the area, taking in every detail. There were scuff marks in the snow, paw prints circling tightly around a deep depression where the human footprints ended. "What happened here?" I muttered aloud. I crouched down, running my gloved hand over the disturbed snow. It was packed tightly, as if someone had fallen or been forced down. A shiver ran through me. The scene was unsettling, like the aftermath of a fight, but there was no blood, no signs of injury. As I stood, I noticed something half buried in the snow a few feet away. I reached for it, brushing off the icy covering, and froze. It was a leash, frayed at the edges as if it had been chewed through. My mind raced with questions. Had the dogs been tied up here? Had they broken free? I looked around again, my eyes scanning the tree line. The forest seemed to close in on me, its silence oppressive. Whoever had been here was long gone, but the leash told me one thing for certain. The dogs hadn't come to my cabin by accident. The sudden snap of a branch behind me made me spin around, my heart leaping into my throat. For a moment, I saw nothing but the endless stretch of trees. Then, from the shadows, I caught a glimpse of movement. "Hello," I called, my voice steadied despite the fear clawing at my chest. The figure that emerged from the trees wasn't human. It was the older German, Shepherd, his golden brown fur a stark contrast against the snow. His tail wagged slightly as he approached, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "You followed me," I said, relief washing over me. He stopped a few feet away, his ears twitching as if listening for something. Then, he barked, a sharp, urgent sound that echoed through the clearing. "What is it, boy?" I asked, taking a step toward him. He barked again, turning his head toward the deeper part of the forest as if he was trying to tell me something, urging me to follow. My hesitation lasted only a moment before I fell in step behind him. My fear was replaced by a growing sense of purpose. Whatever had brought these dogs into my life wasn't over, and as I followed the shepherd into the woods, I knew I was about to uncover a truth I wasn't prepared for. The German shepherd moved with purpose, his paws crunching the snow as he led me deeper into the woods. Every few steps he would glance back at me, his eyes filled with a sense of urgency that made my stomach churn. Whatever he was leading me toward was important, and likely not something I was ready to face. The forest grew denser, the trees forming a canopy that blocked out what little sunlight had broken through the clouds. The air felt colder here, heavier, and the silence was oppressive. My breath came out in invisible puffs as I struggled to keep up with the dog, who seemed tireless despite the ordeal he'd endured. "Where are you taking me, boy?" I muttered under my breath, my voice barely louder than a whisper. He didn't respond, of course, but his pace quickened. We weaved through the trees, following no visible path until we came to a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated shed, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. The shepherd stopped a few feet away from the shed and barked, his tail wagging slightly. He looked at me expectantly, as if urging me to go closer. Hesitated, my mind racing with possibilities. Why had he brought me here? Was someone inside? Had this been where the dogs were kept before they escaped? Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward, the snow crunching loudly under my boots. The closer I got to the shed, the stronger the feeling of unease became. The wood was weathered and rotting, the windows covered with grime. I placed my hand on the door handle, the cold metal biting into my skin, and pushed it open. The door creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the stillness of the forest. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the smell of damp wood and something else, something metallic. My eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls, and what I saw made my heart stop. There were cages, 4 of them, lined up against the far wall. They were empty now, but the remnants of what had been there were unmistakable. Matted fur, chewed-up blankets, and broken bowls scattered across the floor. This wasn't just a shed, it had been a prison. I turned to the shepherd, who was standing just inside the doorway, his tail low and his ears flat against his head. He let out a low whine, and my chest tightened. This was where he and the younger dog had come from. I moved closer to the cages, my hands trembling as I inspected them. The metal bars were bent in places, the locks rusted and broken. It was clear the dogs had escaped, but not without a struggle. My mind filled with images of what they must have endured here. Cold nights, no food, and the fear of whoever had put them in this place. Who had done this, and why? As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A small notebook lying on a makeshift table near the wall. I picked it up, the leather cover cracked and stiff with age. Flipping it open, I scanned the pages, my stomach twisting with every line I read. It was a logbook, dates, descriptions, and details about the dogs that had been kept here. Most of the entries were brief, but one stood out, a description of the older shepherd. Subject number 12, male German shepherd, strong, obedient, Potential for resale. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. These dogs weren't just abandoned. They had been part of something far worse. I closed the notebook, my hands shaking with anger. Whoever had done this hadn't just hurt these animals. They had exploited them, treating them as property instead of living beings. The shepherd let out another bark, snapping me out of my thoughts. He was standing by the doorway, his body tense, his eyes fixed on something outside. "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaky. I followed his gaze and froze. In the distance, through the trees, I saw movement, a figure dark and shadowy watching us. The figure in the distance froze me in place. My pulse quickened and I felt a surge of adrenaline. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing by. They were watching us. The German shepherd stood by the door, his body rigid, his tail low, and his gaze fixed on the shadowy figure. He barked a sharp warning sound that echoed through the clearing. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking slightly. No response. The crunch of boots on snow grew louder as the person came closer, their face still hidden beneath the shadow of a hood. My grip on the logbook tightened as I braced myself for whatever was about to happen. Then the shepherd did something that surprised me. He stepped in front of me, positioning himself like a shield, his body tense and ready. His loyalty in that moment was palpable, and it gave me the courage to stand my ground. As the figure stepped into the clearing, the hood was pulled back, revealing a man in his late 40s, his face weathered and hard. His eyes darted between me and the dog, narrowing when they landed on the notebook in my hand. "That doesn't belong to you," he said, his voice low and threatening. I glanced down at the notebook, my anger flaring. "These dogs don't belong to you either," I shot back. The man smirked, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "You don't know what you're talking about. Leave that here and no one gets hurt." The shepherd growled low in his throat, stepping closer to the man, his presence a warning, a silent promise that he wouldn't let anyone harm me. "What did you do to them?" I demanded, holding up the notebook. "Why were they in those cages? Why are there scars on his body?" The man's smirk faltered. "You're meddling in things you don't understand. Those dogs were property, nothing more." The word property came out like venom. "They're living beings. They have more loyalty and heart than you'll ever have." The man took a step closer, but before he could say anything, the shepherd lunged forward, barking ferociously. The man stumbled back, clearly not expecting the dog's ferocity. "That's enough," he yelled, but his voice cracked with fear. I used the moment to my advantage. "You're going to pay for what you've done," I said, my voice firm. "I'll make sure of it." The man's eyes darted to the forest, as if calculating his escape. Without another word, he turned and bolted, disappearing into the trees. The shepherd chased after him a few steps before stopping, his ears perked and his tail stiff. I dropped to my knees, wrapping my arms around the dog's neck. "Good boy," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You're incredible." He licked my face, his tail wagging for the first time since I'd found him. I knew the man would likely return, but for now I had what I needed: the notebook, the evidence of his crimes. And I had the German shepherd by my side, a loyal companion who had been through hell and back, but still had the courage to protect someone he barely knew. Back at the cabin, I called the authorities, relaying everything I'd found. It wasn't long before officers arrived, taking my statement and the notebook. They promised to investigate, but even as they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The shepherd and the younger dog stayed with me, their bond growing stronger each day. I named the older one Hero because that's exactly what he was. A hero who had survived against all odds and stood by me when it mattered most. As for the man in the woods, I never saw him again, but the scars he left on those dogs and the determination they showed to survive would stay with me forever. Hero taught me something I'd never forget. Loyalty and love don't need words. Sometimes they're shown in actions, in the way a dog stands by you, protects you, and reminds you of the goodness that can still be found in the darkest moments. Heroes. Story is a reminder of the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. His courage and loyalty changed my life forever, and I'm sure there are countless other stories like his waiting to be told. Dogs like Hero deserve love, care, and a chance at a better life, just like he found with me. If you believe in the power of loyalty and second chances, share this story with your friends and family. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more heartwarming and inspiring tales. Let's work together to spread awareness and give every animal the love and protection they deserve.